Good evening. This is Atheist History Week, and I'm John Rafferty, President of the Secular Humanist Society of New York, and also a proud and active member of New York City Atheists, which produces this show. Each week at this time, we look at the week in atheist history, just as the title of the show indicates. We look at the lives of famous, infamous, not so famous people who are free thinkers of various stripes, atheists, humanists, secularists, rationalists, all kinds of people who advance the cause of free thinking, rationality, and skepticism through the ages, for as far back as we know and right up to the present time. We discuss those notable people on the days of their birth or their death or the day that they accomplished something significant. And we also look at religious fun and games, like riots and burnings at the stake and pogroms and other things like that that happen in this week in history. I'd like to start with someone, one of the best known Americans in our history, but in pop culture, and his name is George Gershwin. And he wrote, among other things, a song called It Ain't Necessarily So, for the stage play Porgy and Bess. It ain't necessarily so. I'm not going to try to sing. It ain't necessarily so. The things that you're liable to read in the Bible, they ain't necessarily so. Little David was small, but oh my, he fought big Goliath, who lay down and dieth. Little David was small, but oh my. Oh, Jonah, he lived in the whale, for he made his home in that fish's abdomen. Oh, Jonah, he lived in the whale. Little Moses was found in a stream. He floated on water till old Pharaoh's daughter, she fished him, she says, from that stream. It ain't necessarily so. It ain't necessarily so. They tell all you children the devil's a villain, but it ain't necessarily so. To get into heaven, don't snap for a 7, the song was sung at a crap game. Live clean, don't have no fault. Oh, I take the gospel wherever it's possible, but with a grain of salt. Methuselah lived 900 years, but who calls that living when no gallow given to no man what's 900 years? I'm preaching this sermon to show it ain't ain't necessarily so. The things that you're liable to read in the Bible, they ain't necessarily so. George Gershwin, born on September 26th in 1898 in Brooklyn, New York. He was one of our boys, and he was one of 3 boys in the family, with his brother Ira, who later became his lyricist and went on to a great career of his own, even after George died suddenly during an operation for a brain tumor in 1937, not even 40 years old. George and Ira grew up in a household of East European Jewish origins, but a secular household, which is where George, I guess, got his secularism and his rationalism. His mother, Rose, in Brooklyn, would pull the shades down in the apartment on Shabbos night, on Friday, so that the neighbors would see that she wasn't lighting the candles. Gershwin, George, that is, he was a good friend of, and he said he drew a lot of inspiration from 2 other sources of rationalism, non-believing songwriters, Irving Berlin and Jerome Kern. He taught himself to play the piano by keeping his fingers moving on a player piano that the family had. So he learned how it worked, and he played the piano. he then became a serious student of music. Not only wrote a lot of hit Broadway shows and some great songs that are still being sung. Lady Be Good, Strike Up the Band, Funny Face, The Man I Love, Embraceable You, Somebody Loves Me, and one of my favorites, They Can't Take That Away From Me. But he also turned to serious music and composed probably the two best-known pieces of American classical, as we would call it, music, Rhapsody in Blue and the Concerto in F. Unfortunately, dead, as I said, during surgery for a brain cancer in 1937. George Gershwin. The last week in September is a pretty good week for the birth and the lives of musical free thinkers. Right now, who's less than 30 years old, we have Annie DiFranco, the punk singer, who's born in Buffalo, New York on September 23rd in 1970. I should correct my own pronunciation there. It's Ani, spelled A-N-I, but Ani, and the youngers of you viewers will know that automatically. By 15, she was writing her own songs. She has not yet achieved the status of a Gershwin, but she is a popular singer, songwriter, and rather a pretty good one, and maybe even an important one, who has started her own record company, Righteous Babe Records, and she does the college and rock club circuits, and she sings about growing up surrounded by willful ignorance, she calls it, and the religions of men. I'm an atheist, she says. How unfortunate it is to assign responsibility to the higher up for justice among people. Annie DiFranco. We're going to hear a lot more about her in the future. Dmitri Shostakovich. Another big name. Born September 25th in 1906. Well, in Stalinist Russia, everybody had to be an atheist, whether you were or not. And Shostakovich followed the party line, as he did in many things, but among his friends he was known as no Stalinist in private, and he was an atheist, but not one of the parade leading communist atheists of the Stalinist era. When he was asked if he believed in God, Shostakovich replied, kind of sadly, "No, and I'm very sorry about it," which is an indication that, of course, religious belief is very comforting to many people, and I guess Shostakovich thought, yeah, I'd like to have that kind of comfort, but he was a rationalist. He saw life as it was, and under Stalin, that was not so good. One of his biographers said that in all things political, musical, social, philosophical, he would go through the motions that were necessary in Stalinist Russia. And as a matter of fact, you know, the kind of thing that where he wrote the Eighth Symphony from the point of view of a celebration of life. But somebody in the hierarchy there told him, you're going to call it the War Symphony. And so it's called the War Symphony. He put up with it. He wrote 9 operas and ballets, 37 film scores, 15 symphonies, hundreds of works for choral, solo, piano, concerti, incidental music, chamber music, and he is one of the most admired composers of the 20th century, including by me, who doesn't know much about music. but I like Shostakovich. Not a musician, but a writer, a dramatist, and a very popular author who is associated with one of the best-known pieces of music in the Western world, is Prosper MERIMEE, who was born on September 28th in 1803 in Paris, in France, of course. MERIMEE was the son of an artist, and he initially studied the law, switched to the humanities, and his first play was something called Cromwell, of course, about the British revolutionary and religious fanatic. He did in his early writing, he wrote hoaxes that were taken up by the public and much enjoyed. And he translated Russian classics into French. And he got some government posts, and he wrote several things. He wrote in the novella form, short novella form, and he created the novella Carmen, from which the opera and numerous other plays and films have been made. He's most famous for Carmen, which the opera was created musically by his good friend Georges Bizet. His biographers, we don't have any state. We only have one statement by MERIMEE about his freedom. But his historians, Joseph McCabe and J.M. Robinson, describe him as an atheist and a rationalist. And one of the reasons they can say that is that one quote of MERIMEE's. He said, "The only excuse for God is that he doesn't exist." Prosper MERIMEE, born September 28th in 1803 in Paris, and lived to 1870. Also in France, but a little bit later, Georges Clemenceau was born on September 28th in 1848, to the best of my knowledge with music, but was one of the most important French thinkers, politicians, statesmen, journalists of the 19th and the early 20th century. He was born to a physician father and originally followed in his father's footsteps as a free thinker, and got himself suspended, kicked out of school at 16 for challenging a teacher about Christianity. And when he got out of school, he was writing for Émile Zola's newspaper, Work, Travail, advocating a republic and free speech. This is in the in the mid to later 19th century, when France was flip-flopping back and forth from the Napoleonic family and even some of the old Bourbons from before the original revolution, and back and forth republics. He was a foreign correspondent for Le Temps, the newspaper, and he came to New York in 1865, and where he met his wife, who was teaching French at a ladies' seminary in Connecticut. Clemenceau's book in 1869, The Great God Pan, described how superstitions live on under new names and new guises, that newer religions pick up the superstitions of the old ones, incorporate them, give the old gods new names, give the old ideas a little buffing up, and bring them right along. And the superstitions prevail and continue and continue. He entered politics and was 5 times elected to the National Assembly, and then gave that up and returned to journalism. And in journalism, of course, the major event of the end of the 19th century in France, he was the Dreyfus Affair, where a captain, a Jewish captain in the French army, was convicted of treason, totally trumped up charges, because the French army wanted a scapegoat for their loss in the War of 1870, and Captain Dreyfus was a convenient scapegoat, and so they accused him of selling France's war plans to the Germans. Total BS, but okay. It was the defining political incident of the late 19th and early 20th century in France, and there are still people in France who argue both sides of the question, even though it was proved definitively that Dreyfus was totally innocent. Wound up in Devil's Island. He got out, but people still say the Jew was guilty. Okay, you know, we don't smirk at the French of 100 years ago when we got our loonies running around who won't believe a birth certificate when they see it. He returned to politics just in time to become the Minister of the Interior and then the Premier, and being known as the Tiger during the First World War, and in the chamber, the representatives, and he was, as the Tiger, he held the nation together during the worst part of the First World War for France, where over 1 million Frenchmen died in the trenches. He became known, he was called Père Victoire, Father Victory. The French population basically considered that Clemenceau himself was the one who held the nation together and led them to victory in the First World War, whereas in 1914, 1915, it looked like France was going to be buried in its own blood of the Western Front. When he died in 1929, he was buried with no religious rites whatsoever. And we have this quote of his: "Not only have the followers of Christ made it their rule to hack to bits all those who have not accepted their beliefs, they have also ferociously massacred each other in the name of their common religion of love, under banners proclaiming their faith in Him who had expressly commanded them to love one another." Georges Clemenceau, a free thinker, probably an atheist, and certainly a rationalist, and one of the champions of French free thinking, born September 28th in 1848. And let's come back to this side of the pond and celebrate the life of F. Scott Fitzgerald, who was born September 24th in 1896 in St. Paul, Minnesota. He was born into a Roman Catholic family who were just patriotic enough to name him for Francis Scott Key, the writer of our national anthem, who was also a second cousin of F. Scott Fitzgerald, 3 times removed, meaning 3 generations back. He went to a Catholic prep school, then to Princeton, and he didn't do so hot in school, and he jumped out and joined the Army in 1917 so he could get involved in the First World War. He was sent to boot camp in Alabama, where he met a Southern belle named Zelda Sayer, an 18-year-old from a hotshot, well-to-do Alabama family. If that's not an oxymoron, I don't know. But at any rate, Zelda, they became an item, they got engaged. Zelda broke off their engagement over money because Fitzgerald didn't have any. With the war over, Fitzgerald briefly worked in the advertising business, and then he wrote This Side of Paradise, a novel that got a pretty good reception and made him some money. And then he began writing short stories for the Saturday Evening Post and other magazines. One of the most famous, I got to admit, I never read it, Bernice Bobs Her Hair, about flappers and the beginning of the Jazz Age and the association that would stay with him the rest of his life, the association with the Jazz Age. He was the chronicler of the Jazz Age in fiction. Well, these short stories started making money, and so Zelda thought maybe he was okay after all. And he and Zelda married just about a week after the book came out to tremendous reviews. Zelda's family, they were Episcopalians, and they were not happy about this intermarriage with a Catholic. And but nevertheless, Scott and Zelda were one of the great love stories of the early 20th century in America. They had one child, Frances Scott. Frances is spelled like a girl with an E, and who they called Scotty. And Fitzgerald wrote a number of the best-known novels in the American canon. The Beautiful and the Damned, The Great Gatsby, Tender is the Night, and he and Zelda epitomized the Jazz Age. Hard drinking, hard partying, and Scott Fitzgerald working feverishly all the time to try to keep up with the spending. Zelda broke down. She was a very fragile woman, and she sunk deeper into depressions and eventually wound up in various sanitariums, one after the other. They moved to France for a while. They became great friends of Ernest Hemingway, and lived the life of the 1920s that American expatriates did in both Paris and the south of France on the Riviera. It was all great, and one of the reasons was it was so cheap, but the Fitzgeralds managed to outspend their incomes anyway. Came back to the United States in 1930, and Zelda retreated further and further into religious fanaticism and craziness. And Fitzgerald himself drank too damn much and just retreated almost into complete alcoholism. And when Zelda was definitely never going to come out of the sanitarium, he wrote to his daughter once when she was going to visit her mother at Christmas time. He said, "But be sweet to your mother at Christmas, despite her early Chaldean rune worship, which she will undoubtedly inflict upon you at Christmas." He had no truck, Fitzgerald had no truck with his wife's religion or any other particularly. And when Zelda, who later died terribly in a fire at the sanitarium where she was incarcerated, Fitzgerald by then was working in Hollywood, writing screenplays, very unhappy, and but affair with the gossip columnist Sheila Graham, and died at the age of 44 of a heart attack in her apartment. A few years later, well, not a few years later, about 18 years later, she wrote a book about their relationship called Beloved Infidel, which was a huge bestseller in the late 1950s. Scott Fitzgerald, a freethinker, a tragic figure, whose great mind was eventually poisoned by alcohol and who died at the ridiculously early age of 44 after having produced 3 or 4 of the novels of the 20th century that will last for a very, very long time.